My throat went dry as he said the words, effective immediately. 3 years of spotless audits, 12-hour days, and the same system that kept this company out of federal investigations, erased in a single meeting. He smiled when HR handed me the paperwork, thinking I'd walk away quietly, but I built every compliance framework they still depend on, and in exactly 72 hours, he's going to learn what happens when you remove the person holding the keys. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from? This gets unbelievable fast. The conference room felt colder than usual, though maybe that was just me realizing what was happening. Mark Dennison, our new Vice President of Compliance, sat across the table with that polished consultant smile that never reached his eyes. "Erika, this is about restructuring," he began, sliding a folder toward me like it was a courtesy instead of an execution. My name was printed neatly on the termination notice, time-stamped 3 days before my $190,000 performance bonus. HR sat stiff beside him, pretending to look sympathetic while avoiding eye contact. I'd trained her 6 months ago. "Your role has become redundant," Mark continued, crossing his arms like he was delivering good news. Redundant. That word hit harder than the firing itself. I'd written the compliance frameworks this company depended on. Every data audit, every client certification, my systems. I'd worked through nights to stop the kind of violations that could destroy us. Now this overpaid outsider was eliminating the very position keeping him safe. "You'll receive 2 weeks severance," he said smoothly, already glancing at his phone, signaling the meeting was over. I wanted to speak, but what could I say that he'd understand? I'd seen people like him before, all spreadsheets and strategy decks, no idea what kept the structure from collapsing. I gathered the folder, met his smug smile, and managed one sentence before leaving. "You might want to keep your audit calendar open, Mark." He frowned slightly, not realizing he'd just signed his own countdown. As I walked out of the building with the termination folder still warm in my hand, anger wasn't the thing keeping me steady. It was clarity. Mark thought he'd closed a chapter, but all he'd done was trigger a contract he'd never bothered to read. 3 years earlier, during a merger integration project, I'd rewritten our entire compliance policy library from scratch. While drafting my employment agreement, I'd inserted a small technical clause buried in a paragraph about data verification ownership. It stated that if I was removed from my position before an ongoing audit cycle was completed, all certification models, verification frameworks, and regulatory databases I authored would revert to my personal custodianship until the audit's conclusion. Legal had skimmed over it, assuming it was harmless technical jargon. HR approved it without question. Nobody realized I'd given myself a legal firewall. I'd learned that trick from a former mentor who once told me, "If they don't respect your position, make sure they have to respect your paperwork." He was right. Over the years, I reinforced that clause with precision. Every audit protocol, every verification module, every encryption key I wrote tied back to my personal credentials. My digital signature wasn't just an ID, it was the DNA of the system. I'd architected compliance networks so that removing me wasn't like deleting a user. It was like removing oxygen from an ecosystem. The network could exist, but nothing inside it could breathe. The executives never noticed because it all ran smoothly, invisibly. I never asked for recognition. I didn't need credit. I needed protection. When Mark arrived with his consultant mindset and buzzwords about optimization, I knew his type. They see processes, not people, metrics, not meaning. He believed power came from authority, not from architecture. I let him believe that. When he fired me, he assumed I'd walk away defeated. What he didn't know was that by processing my termination, HR had unknowingly activated a transfer of digital ownership. My systems were now legally mine. Everything from client verification chains to federal compliance trackers would wait for my authorization before running. I didn't build it to be vindictive. I built it to make sure truth couldn't be rewritten by convenience. As the elevator doors closed behind me, I caught my reflection. Calm, almost detached. The anger was gone, replaced by quiet precision. They thought they were erasing me from the company, but they'd only removed the last person holding it together. And once the audit began, the system would reveal exactly who they'd fired. By Tuesday morning, my inbox was a war zone of forwarded messages. The subject lines alone told the story. Urgent, system access failure, critical, verification timeout, escalation required, audit week impact. I hadn't touched a single company server since walking out, yet my absence was everywhere, woven into the fabric of every broken process. The first domino had fallen exactly on schedule. The annual federal audit cycle had begun. Every shipment, transaction, and data certification required live confirmation from the compliance database, the one I'd designed with tiered security and traceable authorizations. When they deactivated my credentials, the system did what it was programmed to do. It froze. The logic was simple. If an audit authority disappears mid-cycle, everything stops to prevent falsified reports. But for Allied LogiCorp, that meant chaos. At 9:14 a.m., the first client flagged a non-compliant alert. By noon, 5 major contracts were suspended pending review. And by evening, the federal audit platform itself had flagged Allied as temporarily non-verifiable. Mark must have been pacing his office, demanding updates from IT while trying to keep his composure on client calls. I could almost hear the panic behind his polished voice. "It's just a technical delay, we're resolving it shortly." Except he couldn't. The servers required a live biometric confirmation from me to reauthorize. I had built that in after watching too many managers approve fake certifications to hit quarterly targets. Now, that safeguard was holding $1.4 billion in shipments hostage. My phone buzzed with a call from a private number. I didn't answer. Instead, I watched as a news alert popped up on my screen. Logistics giant faces audit suspension during federal review week. The article quoted an unnamed insider blaming legacy system dependency. Legacy system? That was me. I laughed quietly, then opened my private monitoring portal. The audit queue was filling with requests, each stamped awaiting primary verification. I clicked through them like reading old memories. Systems I'd built late at night, code I'd refined over weekends, frameworks I'd defended in boardrooms where people like Mark rolled their eyes. Now those frameworks were defending me. At 6:00 p.m., the first internal memo leaked online, a company-wide freeze order. Employees were instructed not to make any data modifications until compliance restored functionality. Departments stalled, client deliveries halted, investors demanded explanations. Meanwhile, I was drinking coffee by my window, watching the city lights flicker over the river, the glow of chaos unfolding miles away. There was no satisfaction in watching people panic, only clarity. Every safeguard I'd installed was doing exactly what it was meant to do: protect truth from manipulation. Still, part of me wondered when Mark would realize this wasn't a glitch. I imagined him calling IT at midnight, voice cracking, insisting someone override the locks. They'd tell him the truth. It can't be overridden without the custodian's biometric signature. Mine. He'd finally understand what I meant when I told him to keep his audit calendar open. Because in 48 hours, the federal auditors would arrive expecting a compliance lead who no longer worked there. And the first question they'd ask would be the one Mark couldn't answer. Who authorized your data integrity models? The clock was ticking, and every second brought him closer to the moment when the company would have to admit that the person they erased was the only one who could save them. By Wednesday, Allied LogiCorp was eating itself alive. From the outside, it still looked like a billion-dollar enterprise. Glass towers, corporate slogans, the illusion of control. But inside, everything was fracturing at once. Overnight, the system I built moved from warning mode to full lockdown. Each failed verification generated a cascade of red alerts that bounced from client servers to the federal audit platform. When the first major client, Pharmaco Freight, halted its medical shipments, Mark must have thought it was a coincidence. By the time the defense contractors froze their transport lines, coincidence had turned into catastrophe. Logistics is a delicate web. One broken thread shakes the entire structure. By noon, Allied's entire network was paralyzed. I didn't have to check my screens to know the scale of the damage. I could feel it ripple through the industry's news wires. The headlines rolled in like waves. Allied LogiCorp audit suspension disrupts supply chain. 1.4B in contract stalled pending verification. Federal office demands explanation. Investors called for emergency meetings, and the stock ticker plummeted in real time. The company that had treated compliance like a formality was now learning what non-compliance really costs. I heard from a friend still inside. She whispered that the boardroom was chaos. Executives arguing, lawyers on speakerphones, IT swearing they couldn't override the system. Someone had finally read the data custody clause and realized what it meant. Allied didn't own its own verification authority anymore. HR's decision to deactivate my credentials had legally transferred it to me. They couldn't move, certify, or ship without my biometric authorization. Mark, desperate, ordered the tech team to reconstruct a new verification system. They tried. The moment they did, the audit integrity scanner flagged the change as tampering and reported it automatically to the federal office. It was poetic. He was digging deeper every time he tried to escape. I imagined him standing in front of the board, sweating under those harsh LED lights, using corporate jargon to cover panic. "We're managing a short-term access disruption," he'd say, but the auditors wouldn't buy it. They'd see the lockout for what it was, a compliance integrity failure during an active audit cycle. That's not an inconvenience, that's a federal offense. By the end of the day, external auditors were on site. Mark's badge logs showed him entering the server room 3 times without authorization, trying to override my encryption. Those actions alone would cost him his certification. Meanwhile, my phone lit up with media requests, former colleagues, and one surprisingly polite email from Allied Legal. "Ms. Malone, we would appreciate your urgent cooperation in clarifying technical issues." I didn't answer. The system didn't need my help to tell the truth. Still, I watched. The company portal crashed under load. Client dashboards filled with red banners, pending verification, custodian unavailable. Federal auditors sent escalation notices. Within hours, government contractors froze payments. The company's liquidity dried up like a river in drought. Employees who once ignored my warnings were now sitting in frozen conference rooms, afraid to touch their keyboards. I pictured the HR director, the same one who couldn't meet my eyes during the termination, now fielding calls from terrified department heads. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had treated compliance like a checkbox. Now it was their coffin lid. And through it all, I didn't have to move a finger. My revenge wasn't loud or impulsive. It was structural. Every safeguard I'd built to protect truth had activated in perfect sequence. The collapse was silent, procedural, and absolute. That night, as the rain tapped against my apartment windows, I scrolled through the latest update. Federal audit confirms custodian lockout due to termination error. It wasn't just a headline, it was an obituary for arrogance. Mark had fired the gatekeeper, and in doing so, locked himself out of his own kingdom. There was no anger left in me now, only certainty. The system was doing what I designed it to do: expose what happens when people mistake integrity for inconvenience. And the next morning, when the federal team arrived to audit the wreckage, they would see exactly whose signature had held that empire together all along. Thursday began like the calm before a storm. Gray sky hanging low over the river, the city too quiet for what was about to happen. At 9:12 a.m., my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a Washington, D.C. area code. I already knew who it would be. "Ms. Malone, this is Angela Ruiz from the Federal Logistics Compliance Office," the woman said in a tone that was equal parts polite and urgent. "We're conducting a real-time review of Allied LogiCorp's audit systems, and your name keeps appearing as the registered custodian of all verification models. Can you confirm your current employment status?" I told her I was terminated 72 hours ago. She paused, then asked the question she already knew the answer to. "Does your employment contract contain a data custody clause?" "It does," I said, "and it transfers ownership to me until the audit closes." The sound of paper shuffling came through the line, followed by muffled voices in the background. Auditors, lawyers, executives trying to translate panic into procedure. Then another voice joined, rough around the edges and exhausted. "Erika, it's Mark Dennison." He sounded smaller, stripped of the smooth confidence that had filled that conference room days earlier. "We need to fix this. Whatever happened, it's gotten out of control." I didn't flinch. "Mark, you're not authorized to speak in this call," I said. Angela didn't interrupt. Her silence was permission. "Mr. Dennison," she finally said, "we'll need you to stay muted while we clarify contractual matters." The next few minutes were a masterclass in professional reckoning. Angela read excerpts from my contract aloud while another auditor confirmed the legal timestamp of my termination. Every word landed like a hammer. The system hadn't malfunctioned, it had obeyed the contract. Allied had signed. Angela asked the final question softly, as if careful not to break the moment. "Ms. Malone, is there any way you could restore access for our team to complete the federal audit?" "Only through the registered custodian," I said, "which is me. I'm willing to assist, but under a consulting agreement directly with your office or the affected clients. My rate starts at $650 an hour." The quiet that followed stretched long enough to hear the weight of realization on their end. "Understood," Angela said. "We'll formalize the request immediately." Mark tried once more, voice cracking. "Erika, please, this could destroy us." I let a beat pass before responding. "It already has, Mark. You destroyed it the moment you decided my job was redundant." He tried to argue, but Angela cut him off with the cold efficiency of protocol. "Mr. Dennison, further communication will go through legal channels." The line went dead a few minutes later, replaced by the buzz of incoming emails. Federal contracts, client authorizations, formal requests for assistance. My inbox became a mirror of the chaos he'd created. I brewed coffee and watched the digital fallout unfold. News alerts started flashing before noon. Former compliance manager called to restore frozen audit. Federal office confirms contract error behind audit lockdown. And finally, the one that ended Mark's career. VP responsible for compliance collapse placed on administrative leave. By sunset, the board had issued a statement naming him non-compliant with internal oversight standards. That was the corporate way of saying fired. I didn't celebrate. I just exhaled for the first time in days. I'd never needed revenge to feel justified. The truth was enough. Systems I built with integrity had spoken louder than I ever could. And somewhere in that building, Mark finally understood that compliance isn't paperwork, it's consequence. By the following week, Allied LogiCorp's headquarters looked more like a recovery ward than a corporation. Mark Dennison had resigned under mutual agreement, though the leaked internal memo said otherwise. The board named an interim compliance director, but it was only for optics. Every critical verification still funneled through me. The federal office formalized my consulting contract within 48 hours, granting me temporary custodianship to complete the audit. In 3 days, I restored what Mark had dismantled, reconnected the verification chains, and signed off every frozen shipment. The backlog cleared within 72 hours. The clients noticed. So did the media. My inbox filled with messages from companies I'd never worked with, all asking for consultations on audit integrity. That's when the idea formed. No more building systems for executives who ignored them. No more explaining compliance to people who only valued results. I incorporated Verisure Analytics, a boutique compliance certification firm built on one principle: truth first, politics last. Within a month, 5 of Allied's largest clients signed service contracts with me directly. The irony was sharp. Allied now paid triple my old salary just to keep their certifications alive. I didn't gloat. Revenge wasn't the goal. Redirection was. Mark's downfall wasn't my victory. It was the system doing what it was meant to do: expose arrogance. On the day I moved into my new office overlooking the river, a message from an old coworker appeared on my phone. "They finally replaced Mark. The new VP asked if you'd consider training the department again." I smiled, typing only 2 words: send proposal. Outside, the skyline gleamed with early winter light, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt at Allied: peace. Integrity had outlasted ego. My systems were still working, my reputation was intact, and the truth had found its way home. They'd tried to erase me to save money, but they ended up writing my name into every audit manual in the industry. And in a way, I was grateful. They taught me the most valuable lesson a professional can learn. Sometimes the cleanest revenge is just doing your job too well to ever be forgotten. Months later, when the noise faded and the headlines moved on, I kept one of the old Allied Access badges in my desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Every time I saw it, I remembered the look on Mark's face when the system he dismissed as overcomplicated brought his empire to its knees. People often asked if I ever felt guilty for what happened. I didn't. Guilt comes from doing harm. I only let truth surface. What collapsed wasn't my doing. It was the natural result of removing integrity from an organization built on compliance. The difference between revenge and justice is intent. I didn't plan to destroy anyone. I just refused to compromise what I'd built. In the end, the same precision that once protected their data protected me. I've since trained dozens of companies on that principle. Document everything. Protect your authorship. Never let fear make you quiet. Because integrity doesn't vanish when you're fired, it waits. It waits in code, in clauses, in signatures that outlive arrogance. The world moves fast, and executives forget who built the systems that make their profits possible. But systems remember. They always do. And when they do, truth becomes its own form of retribution. That's what I tell my new clients whenever they ask why compliance matters. It's not about punishment or paperwork. It's about insurance for your integrity, the kind that can't be deleted, rewritten, or replaced by someone with a better title. I used to think being good at your job was enough, that if you worked hard, stayed late, and followed the rules, fairness would eventually show up. But what happened at Allied taught me that competence alone doesn't protect you. It just makes you a bigger target for people who don't understand your value. I watched an entire company fall apart because one executive couldn't tell the difference between efficiency and arrogance. He called my systems overly complicated. What he really meant was he couldn't control them. Or me. The truth is, arrogance doesn't always come in shouts. Sometimes it wears a tailored suit and a calm voice while it quietly dismantles everything that works. When the audit failed, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. I'd spent years trying to explain why compliance mattered, why integrity wasn't optional. Watching it collapse confirmed what I already knew. Systems don't fail people. People fail systems. The experience cost me peace, but it gave me clarity. I learned that protecting your work means protecting your name, your proof, your trail of truth. So if you're ever underestimated, don't fight louder, document better. Every note, every clause, every signature is quiet power. Arrogance burns fast. Integrity endures. How to get started today. Keep a personal archive of every major project or decision you contribute to. Learn the basics of your employment agreement, especially ownership clauses. Never rely on verbal assurances. Confirm everything in writing. When leadership dismisses your warnings, log the date and the details. Trust your instincts. If something feels exploitative, it probably is. Have you ever watched arrogance destroy something you worked hard to build? Tell me what it cost and what you learned from it.